You're listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Radio Hour podcast. I'm Justin Beahm. This episode's going to be all Q&A. This was suggested by listener Steven Awalt. Steven, thank you for the concept. What we've been doing over the last few days here is taking questions via the show voicemail, through email, and through messaging on social media. The show voicemail is always open at 951-357-6955 and also by email at radiohourpod@gmail.com. Always happy to hear from you. And as always, you can go to justinbeahm.com for upcoming releases, past releases, and all sorts of news and links to interviews and things like that. Speaking of which, I was recently on a few different podcasts. This tends to kind of pick up around fall, but I'm continuing on the Get Me Another podcast series that they're calling Get Me Another Friday the 13th. I think I may have mentioned this before, but the concept behind the show, which is hosted by Chris and Rob, two friends of mine, is that they take a blockbuster film and then they explore over the course of maybe 10 episodes or so other films that were sort of trying to latch on to that success in the wake of that bigger film. And they brought me on for the entire run of Get Me Another Friday the 13th. And we've been looking at a number of films from the Friday the 13th franchise, as well as films it inspired, which so far have included Don't Go in the Woods, Just Before Dawn, The Burning, and Madman. There are a lot more episodes on the way. We record just about every week on that, and we are going to run through 10 full episodes. It's a total blast, and I hope you enjoy that show. Get Me Another is on all podcast platforms, and you can also track them down on social media. Another show that I was recently on was my friend Brandon Peters, who had me on a number of times over the years. This time it was to discuss the production of Bringing Out the Dead for Paramount. It was a project that I had mentioned to him way back when, before it was even actually a thing, saying this is one I want to get to happen someday. And because it finally did, he reached out to me, and we had a wonderful conversation as a result, where we get into that very wild production that I've talked about here on the program on previous episodes. So the Brandon Peters Show is on YouTube. It's on all different podcasting platforms as well, and I hope you check that out and enjoy that discussion. This episode is landing on Monday, October 7th, and this coming weekend is Halloweenapalooza in Ottumwa, Iowa. Details on it are at Halloweenapalooza.com and also social media if you search for that term. I've been a part of this show many times over the years. My good friends over at Prescribed Films, Mike and Jason, run this event and always do a tremendous job with it. It's not just a convention, it's also a film festival. They have lots of interactive things happening like Q&As. There's going to be a zombie walk that kicks everything off every year, after parties. There's just so much going on there. And this year, in addition to having a table at the show where I'm going to have back issues of magazines like Fangoria, things like that, copies of movies for sale, I'll have the Steve Reverb CD with me, some posters, and a bunch of other fun stuff. I will be presenting the art of documentary filmmaking. That's going to be me sharing stories from my years working in the trenches, doing special features and documentary stuff for all the different studios and distributors, talking about tips and tricks for that side of things, just general interviewing tips that I've developed over time, and then just a lot of stories from the road. There's also going to be a Q&A portion at the end of that. I first presented this at the Snake Alley Festival of Film earlier this year, and it was a lot of fun there. This is actually an expanded version of what was presented at that event. So I'm very, very much looking forward to the art of documentary filmmaking and Halloweenapalooza as a whole. It's always one of my favorite events, and if there's ever a year where I have to miss it, like last year for work, it's certainly one of those things that I'm like, damn it, because there's so much fun. It is steeped in Halloween everything, and these guys run a really top-notch show. And it's at the Bridgeview Center there, which now has a newer hotel right in the same parking lot. So super convenient for you to check it out. And so cannot recommend it highly enough, and I certainly hope to see you there. Let's dive right into the Q&A portion of the show. Again, thank you to Steven Awalt for listening, first of all, and also suggesting doing a Q&A episode. This should be a lot of fun. We'll start with the first voicemail here.
Justin, it's Josh. So I have a couple of questions for you, 3 in fact. First 2 are related to hockey. Number 1, where did your love of the sport of hockey come from? Number 2, when are you going to start playing again? And number 3, can you give us your favorite horror-themed professional wrestler? That's all for now. See you later.
Josh of Josh Luce and the Plan 9. Great to hear from you, as always here. Interesting questions. My love for hockey, man, that dates back to when I was little, and the town park that was closest to where I lived used to fill up. There's sort of this dugout area by the parking lot there. It's called Tobby Park in Marion, Iowa. And they would fill it with water in the winter and then let it freeze over. And they would put plywood up on the 3 exposed sides of the pavilion right next to it, and then put a little coal heater in there for people to be able to show up and skate and not freeze completely, maybe take a break here and there. It was a really cool thing that the city used to do that they haven't done in a very long time, but there were also skates there. So if you didn't have some, you could just put on whatever you could find and then head out to the ice. And certainly weren't necessarily hockey sticks always available or pucks, but you would grab a branch if you didn't have a stick there. We would always try to take a stick if we could, or find one, or have a friend that might bring one, and we'd play pond hockey there. And then years later, playing league hockey. At one point, I was in 2 leagues at the same time, just hustling my ass off and loving every second of it. I ended up playing with Josh in a couple leagues at a certain point, and we had so much fun. I mean, it was just wild, going out there kind of blind and just diving in head first. And so many memories from hitting the ice there. And Josh continues to play, and this leads into his second question: when am I going to start playing again? After my car accident in 2016, I was told not to play anymore because of my back and an injury that I sustained that continues as a thing to this day. But I last year started picking up gear when the hockey season ended. Actually, it would have been earlier this year. So I'm reamassing everything that I need to get back out there. And I've gone to a few open ice times, some open skates. One night I did a stick and puck, but it's going to take a little while for me to get my wheels under me again, I guess you could say, and get back out there full time. I had a goal to start playing this fall, but the summer, as I've mentioned on previous episodes, was just pure insanity schedule-wise, and I wasn't able to devote the time that it would take to get, sort of ready to be ice-worthy again. However, I do have the new goal of starting to play by spring. So this winter, I do plan to hit the ice as much as I can and get that happening here. And Josh, you are an inspiration to me. When you started playing again, you were off for a time as well, and you went back full force. And I've been so blown away by you playing in these leagues and tournaments, and now your daughter's playing, which is absolutely wonderful. And it's incredible to see you out there, and I love all of your updates that I'm getting by text before and after your games, or phone calls when you're on the road. I treasure it, man. And so I'm going to hold to my promise that I will be getting back out there soon. And now I think I'll have the time to dedicate to that. I'm really looking forward to it. And then doing some tournament stuff together again. That'd be a hell of a lot of fun. Bill Van Vagel, my friend from Land of the Creeps podcast, he and I are always messaging about hockey. And same thing with Sean Davis. We're always messaging about hockey and keeping each other up on the latest news. And I'm just thrilled that here we are, second week of October. Things are in full swing now with the NHL as of this week. And I couldn't be happier. Absolute bliss. So, yeah, Josh, the hockey thing, it will happen, and it will happen soon. My favorite horror-themed pro wrestler, Oy, oy, oy. I don't know that there's really been very many good ones. Can you think of any? I remember the deathmatch tapes from this tournament that happened. I think it was in Japan from years ago, maybe like the mid 90s or something. This would have been the same tournament, the King of the Death Match, I think it was called. It was the same tournament where it was Terry Funk versus Mick Foley in the final match, and Mick ended up winning, and Terry got beat up real bad in that thing. But these tapes had not just the King of the Death Match tournament matches on them. I remember there were 2 volumes. I still have them somewhere from back in the tape trading days, like where you'd see an ad in the back of a magazine and say, they're like, oh, wrestling tapes for sale or rare horror for sale. And it would just be all bootleg stuff that you couldn't find proper releases of anywhere else. And anyway, I wanted to see this deathmatch stuff real bad and ordered these tapes. On them, they have a bunch of other matches that are kind of death matches for that time. I mean, this stuff really doesn't hold a candle to what they call death matches today. I'm always shocked by what I see on Instagram and wherever else of these guys that are doing just the most vile, brutal, vile stuff to themselves. It's of no interest to me. But back then, at the time when I was into wrestling again and wanting to explore more stuff, it was very exciting to track this down. And anyway, to the point of the question here, they had a bunch of different matches from other events, and they included wrestlers that were based on some horror villains. So there was Jason the Terrible. There was Freddy Krueger. I think he was just called Freddy. And then there were several Leatherfaces, which I thought was pretty weird. And one of them, at least one of them, was actually in the King of the Deathmatch tournament. But it was really surreal to see these essentially just guys in Halloween store masks and costumes hitting the ring and portraying these iconic horror villains on these on these crazy deathmatch tournaments. I remember there was one match where I think it was Freddy versus Jason, and Jason got Freddy down and put his arm over one of those metal guardrails that sit in front of the audience around the ring. And people were yelling at him, break his arm, break his arm. And then it looked like he really did. That was probably the most shocking thing that I saw on those tapes. And certainly not my cup of tea necessarily anymore. But man, was it something wild and different at the time. As far as other horror wrestlers, the Yeti from WCW. I'm in the world of wrestling, my interest in it is primarily tied to historical stuff, like the history of it really fascinates me, but also the worst of it. I am 100% a wrestle crap guy. I love the bad gimmicks, the bad pay-per-views and concept matches, gimmick stuff. It's all so funny and amusing and fun to watch with friends. Because serious wrestling, okay, they can do great moves and whatnot, but I love the bad stuff because nothing's better to watch. Kind of like movies. A lot of the stuff that's on the fringes or that might not be considered so great is absolutely what is the biggest blast to watch with your buddies. So it's the same with wrestling. And I remember WCW, they had a pay-per-view. I don't even remember which one it was, but there was this big fracas in the ring, and one of them called somebody from the back, and out comes this gigantic man who looks like a mummy. He's wrapped in like toilet paper or something. He's lumbering to the ring. He comes in, and then I think it's Tony Schiavone. One of the announcers starts yelling, "It's the Yeti! It's the Yeti!" But he didn't look at all like a Yeti. There was no hair involved. There have been wrestlers who had that kind of gimmick, like Giant Gonzalez, whatever his name was, when he was wearing like a full body fake hair suit that was so ridiculous. But anyway, this Yeti, this weirdo mummy, whatever it was, comes in the ring and just grabs Hulk Hogan and starts dry humping him from behind. It is truly one of the great moments in wrestling history. And I don't know that he was ever seen again after that. I'm not really sure. But I love that character so much that I've made a t-shirt of him at one point that I wear sparingly, but I got a thing for a free t-shirt at some point, put your picture on it. So I sent in a screen cap of the Yeti, and there it is. So I love that. I love Chainsaw Charlie, which was one of Terry Funk's later year horrible gimmick ideas when he was in the WWF for a little while before he, I don't know, wrapped it up or whatever. And that's where he was putting pantyhose over his head and acting like Leatherface, running into the ring with a chainsaw, like popping out of the ring with the saw running and stuff. Oh, man. And then, who could forget the dungeon of, what the hell was it called? It was on a Halloween Havoc pay-per-view for WCW, which if you want bad matches, just look up WCW, especially toward the end. Man, they had some really rough, very poorly planned stuff going on. But one of them was this like Dungeon of Horrors match where at the center of the ring was an electric chair. And you would lose the match when you were put into the electric chair and the switch was pulled and you were fried. So that was the thing. And lo and behold, they get, I think it was Abdullah the Butcher, into that chair at a certain point. After this ring had caught on fire too at a certain point, accidentally. Some of the props that were hanging off it caught on fire. It was so bizarre, so weird. And then they get Abdullah the Butcher in the chair. The switch, I think, had fallen down on its own or something. I don't really remember. But they eventually do intentionally pull it. And then he starts gyrating and there's sparks flying. And he's supposed to be dead, but then he gets back up and like runs out of the ring or whatever. So, oh, WCW. So many bad ideas. So many poorly executed things. But the horror thing in wrestling can be super funny. There's been some great stuff over time. Those are just a few. Great questions, Josh, as always. And man, I will see you on the ice soon.
So, Justin, this is Sean, also the Haddonfield Hatchet, making a comeback for just a moment. So I want to reach out, and I wanted to ask you, I don't know if this has been asked of you before, but what are some of your influences that have pushed you towards a career in writing and towards documentary filmmaking? More along the lines of, like, I would say, growing up, your favorite horror films, your favorite writers, and such like that has led you on the path that you're on. Which, by the way, everything you do is gold, my friend. Everything. Love the special features. Love reading the articles and all the magazines. Great stuff. Love you, brother.
Sean, thank you for calling in. And, oh, man, for the nice words. I really appreciate it. Your support has always meant so much. And it's wonderful to have you chime in here on this episode. When I think back to what really brought me to this world, especially on the writing side, I've been writing little things since I was small, and I didn't really think anything of it, and my parents didn't really pay particular attention to it in any way. But there was a teacher when I was in third grade named Mr. Gorsh at Wilkins Elementary in Marion, Iowa, where I went to elementary school. And he was the first one to read my writing and tell me that I was a writer. It was the first time I remember it very clearly. His support it was the first adult to sort of, I don't know, what do you say, like make me feel valid in some way with writing. And of course, at that time, what am I writing? Simple little things for school, stories about summer or whatever it might have been. But it really meant a lot to me for Mr. Gorsh to offer that kind of support because I didn't really get it anywhere else. And he was just all around a really influential teacher, super supportive person in general of all the kids, very creative, and was very encouraging of everyone's creative endeavors. A compassionate person too. We had guinea pig in the class, and he just taught the kids how to really care for an animal, how to mine real emotion out of the little stories that we were reading. And Mr. Gorsh was such a huge influence on me. And I don't know how long he was teaching after that year, but I certainly hope that he continued for a long time, because I know everybody that was in his class that year walked away better as a result of it. And then there was a teacher in fifth grade, Mrs. Pratt, who really pushed the writing thing. I mean, at this point, I was doing a lot of writing stories, short stories, and like selling them to kids in the school. I'd photocopy them and sell them for $0.25 a piece or whatever. And I started messing around with little poetry stuff at this time. And Mrs. Pratt really was the one who was encouraging me, not just through words, but also she would challenge me. She would issue a challenge on something to write about, even though it wasn't necessarily for school. It wouldn't be project based. She would say, hey, write me a story about whatever. Like maybe she'd throw a couple things at me, like a kid in a castle and what would happen to him. And then I'd go home and pore over these ideas and really be just writing for her and for myself. And there are teachers like that I hope everyone can reflect on, look back in your life at these people who made such a tremendous difference. And I feel so fortunate to have had those two. There have been other teachers that I can point to over time that were really wonderful as well. But in terms of direct influence and helping me feel like what I was doing was worth my time, it would be Mr. Gorsh and then Mrs. Pratt, who really set me on the course for all of this. And then, as I've told the story many times, when it came to the documentary stuff, I grew up in a house without cable, so there was a lot of PBS happening, and it was on all weekend for the most part. And so I loved everything that was on PBS, in addition to the usual sort of Saturday morning cartoons and Pee-wee's Playhouse and all that stuff. Then I'd switch over to PBS, and that's where it would be for the rest of the weekend when we weren't watching movies. So I think that was influential for me on the documentary front. My parents always watched the news every night, and my dad was working at the newspaper for many years. So I was always interested in the media in those ways. But then it was my local library in town where I spent so much time as a kid, and not just in the kids' room downstairs, which had had all the read-along books with records and tapes and the Crestwood House monster books that I've talked so much about, but also up once I made my way upstairs into the adult stacks, reading about movies and the history and the production and the special effects makeup and all of that. It was really that time when I would have been starting around the 5th grade or so, and that point forward where I was hooked, reading Fangoria and Famous Monsters, and then picking up all these books on film. And it was the same with music. I've always been a huge nonfiction reader. I remain primarily a nonfiction reader. Books I'm reading, listening to, podcasts that I really enjoy. I'm so into nonfiction because I'm just endlessly fascinated by people's lives. And that, I think that's why it became my work. And I feel very, very at home in that field. And it was really easy for me to plug into it in a world where finding a career in this business is so crazy. But I wasn't having to like fake it till I made it kind of a thing. It was like, no, I can plug into this immediately because writing for the magazines leading up to the film documentary stuff, it all kind of felt like it was from the same realm inside of me. And that all began back when I was a kid and just reading as much stuff as I could on anything. Every musician that I loved, I still have a lot of those really early books that I picked up. I frequented the local bookstores in town that were like Paperback Exchange was one. Anywhere there was used books for cheap, I certainly was there all the time. And then, of course, the library. So nonfiction became my thing really early on. And that's what led to everything else. And now I can look back at the sort of later years when I was in my maybe early 20s and things, when I discovered the documentaries of Ken Burns, when I started watching special features on DVDs at that time, the Full Moon Video Zone segments at the end of all of Charlie's Full Moon tapes were always so exciting for me because I love lifting that curtain. And yeah, I mean, of course, never dreamed that I'd be able to do it for a living, but sometimes things happen, and I'm certainly honored that that's been the case here. So that's where it all began for me. Favorite movies and all of that. I was so open to anything. The most frequently rented stuff when I was a kid, outside of horror movies like the Universal Monster classics, you'd be looking at like Strange Brew. My brother and I rented that so many times. We can quote the entire thing front to back. and then I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. We were really big comedy fans, but in addition to all the spooky stuff that we would check out, I mean, Chainsaw Massacre was hugely influential because that was the first kind of gritty, real feeling horror film that I saw after years of just being exposed to like Universal stuff and Ed Wood movies and older black and white things. That was a real sort of gut punch of a film you wear when you turn it off. And I remember every single thing about the day I first saw that film. And the list, I could just go on and on and on. Seeing Jason Takes Manhattan at my uncle's house, the only person in the world that I knew with a big screen TV. And we went there in Wisconsin to spend the weekend with them. And my folks were upstairs, and my brother and I were left to our druthers downstairs in front of this massive TV that also had HBO on it. And so we, of course, flipped right to HBO like we always would in any hotel room, especially after Mom and Dad went to bed. And there it was, a Friday the 13th marathon. Jason Takes Manhattan starts, and I just sat there terrified, captivated, and loving it. That was an awesome experience. Not awesome at the time for me necessarily, at least in the days and weeks that followed with my nightmares and stuff, but that was really, really cool time. Sean, I mean, just like you, man, there's so many different films throughout our lives that have a tremendous impact on us. And the early stuff for me, it all roads go back to Universal Monsters, the Crestwood House books, and that stuff that I've talked about so many times over the years. As far as favorite authors, I think I'm probably going to sound relatively run-of-the-mill in saying this, but it was Stephen King was my number one. He remains that for me. I loved getting into H.P. Lovecraft. I was a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe in particular. I still collect different editions of Edgar Allan Poe collections and really treasure him. When I was in Baltimore last year to spend a day with John Waters, I made a point to stop by Poe's grave and other Poe historically important sites around the area because I had never been there before, and I knew I had to take the opportunity while I had it. So Poe's a big one. I mean, King just remains, though, the one. I'm a big fan of all the King podcasts like Losers Club, and I still listen on repeat to On Writing, which I think is one of the greatest books ever written on the craft. It also is probably the best autobiographical document from King, even though he's been interviewed ad nauseum. I mean, like, what is there left to talk about with him? He sits atop my list of dream interviews, but I frankly have no idea what we would talk about because he's covered everything over time. But On Writing, if anyone is out there looking to become a writer, wants to learn about story structure or whatever, or if you just want to learn about Stephen King's story from the time he was a kid forward, it is one of my favorite books of all time, period, full stop. Dance Macabre is another good one from him, where it was an earlier book for King, where he was talking about his favorite films and books and television shows and things like that. And there's a new audiobook version of that too. There was a terrible audiobook that's been circulating for years. And just this last week, as I'm recording this, a new version of that book came out on Audible that I'm really grateful for, and I'm enjoying listening through to it again. But Dance Macabre and On Writing, if you pick up those two books, the best, I guess you'd say, nonfiction work from Stephen King that I've come across. But I never get tired of his books, his stories. And same with Poe. I love this CD set that I have that has Basil Rathbone and Vincent Price reading Edgar Allan Poe stories. Those are really precious to me. And outside of all that, I was just into any journalist that was writing for the magazines that I loved. Anybody who was writing books that were telling the stories behind the scenes on the making of films, and anybody who was writing about the musical artists that I love. If you're an Elvis fan, you can't go wrong with the two Peter Guralnick books about Elvis. One covers the sort of first half of his career, and then the second covers the rest of his career. And this is warts and all. These Guralnick books are absolutely indispensable. And there's another really good one that's Elvis's, I think it's called like Life and Recordings, something like that. But it's a chronological compilation of stories behind the scenes of every single recording session he ever had. And it gives a lot of context before and after each one, too, about where he was at in his career at that time. Very fascinating. I remember a book when I was a kid called Remembering Buddy that was about Buddy Holly. And I checked that out so much from my local library that when they decided to discard it, they called me and asked if I wanted to keep it, because I would go in there checking it out over and over and over again. That's a really great one. I mean, just whatever I could find that was capturing the stories of people's lives and stuff. Always very important to me. But then film was probably, film was everything to me. And Jim Morrison of The Doors, he's the one who got me into poetry, got me into reading Rimbaud and all these other authors that are out there, and expanded my view of literature in a huge way. And I remain a big fan of Jim's work. There's a couple of different versions of it, but Jim released a few poetry books in his life, and then posthumously after he passed away. And there's a great one called The Collected Works of Jim Morrison that came out, I think, a couple years ago. It's a huge, like, Bible-sized book that has some scans of his notebook pages in addition to just text from not only his poetry, but his lyrics and some different personal notebook things. That's really cool. So I don't know. I could go on all day about this stuff, but so many authors that I love and that were instrumental to me. And at the top of that mountain is Stephen King, of course. Thank you so much for calling in, man. Love to you and the family as well. And I'm sure I'll be texting you later tonight. So thanks again for calling in, brother.
Justin Beahm Radio Hour. I'm finally calling in to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour. It's so great to finally do this. I keep saying I'm going to do it. This is your old pal, Shane Bundy, calling in from Cleveland. I wanted to congratulate you, first of all, on your 35th podcast. 35 of these things, man. I'm telling you, this podcast, there is no travel destination that is too far away when I'm listening to these podcasts on the way to wherever I'm going. It makes travel so simple and so fast. So thank you for all of the great years, and appreciate you coming back after a hiatus. So glad to hear your voice again out there. So congratulations on 35. Also, I wanted to tell you, Steve Reverb and the Sound Tones. What a great CD. Thank you for finally putting that out. I can't believe what I've been missing all these years. If your listeners don't know, this is a great CD that Justin has put out. It's on his website. You can pick it up. It's a surf rock CD that you can't live without. I don't care what genre you listen to of music, this one's gonna do it for you. So what a great, fantastic CD. I've been listening to it nonstop. I love it. Hey, and another thing that's been happening lately, I gotta give you a shout out for is, you've been in so many of these magazines that we love. Fangoria, Famous Monsters, Scream, your column every month in Remind Magazine. But man, congratulations on finally gracing the elite pages of Rue Morgue. This is going to be so great. I actually just got my issue in the mail not long ago, and I'm going to be reading this ceremoniously when the time is right, when the leaves are falling. I'm going to have it. But congratulations on finally getting into Rue Morgue. What a great magazine that is. So happy for you on that. When we were in our late teens, early 20s in Peoria, Illinois, we would be the first ones at the newsstand as soon as a new issue of Fangoria came out. And in that issue of Fangoria, we would turn right to this list that they had called the chopping list. And these were all the video rentals that were out that you could possibly rent. And you and I would go into this, and we would go into the local video store, and we would try to we would be lucky if we got like 50% of this list taken care of. And we would watch some of the worst movies, but some of the best movies that we've ever seen. And we still talk about today, through that list. But, you know, when we were going and, you know, going through the pages of Fango, never in a million years did I think that not only would you be writing for Fango and all these other excellent magazines, but that, you know, we'd be talking about how you're interviewing Nick Cage. We're talking about how you're on the phone with John Carpenter and that you're breaking bread with him and his wife, and you're going to you're at Oliver Stone's house, or I don't know where. But anyway, you're hanging out with Hollywood elite here and going through and producing some of the greatest stuff here. So anyway, wild that you're here. Congratulations. All right, I'm going to stop inflating your ego here, and I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to keep it down. Let's keep it to Shout Factory only. So Shout Factory, you've got a laundry list of titles that you've done for them, and they're all fantastic. It's so amazing, the stuff that you get into. But can you talk a little bit about how that comes about? How do your assignments come about? Do they have a list of movies that you can pick from, or are you assigned a batch of movies and you have no idea what they're going to be? Like, how are you able to guide which ones you take on, and then, you know, do you like them all, or do you have to, you know, like them later as you get into the project? So that's my question. You know, how does that process work, and then what is your feeling toward some of the projects? I mean, you know, are you a huge fan of everyone, or is some of them, you know, just kind of there? But anyway, thank you so much for all of the podcast and all the entertainment, man. Really appreciate it. Reverend Entertainment rules. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Justin.
Oh my God, what an incredible voicemail from Shane. Yeah, Shane and I go way back, as you heard there. He is still one of my closest friends in this universe and someone that I'm in touch with pretty much every day. We used to work at Co-op Records. We were at two different locations of Co-op Records. He was we were both in Peoria. There were three locations in that area. He was at the downtown kind of campus location. I was out in the sticks in this strip mall. And then there was one in East Peoria as well. But anyway, Shane and I, we immediately hit it off when we met, bonded over the Misfits and our love of all things Danzig. And that led into, just that, it was the highlight of every day working in that store. This is back in the day of faxes, okay? And we'd be sending each other these goofy faxes all day long, calling each other's stores, pretending to be certain people and asking for weird shit. And it was incredible. But yeah, our bond formed very quickly and grew into our shared love of horror. And I absolutely, Shane, remember the video chopping list and how we would try to get as many of those titles as we could in hand for these epic movie nights where we would get together and watch, 2 or 3, sometimes more films in one setting. And it wasn't just chopping list stuff, of course, because as you said, it was tough to find all that new stuff because we didn't have a ton of video rental stores in the area, but we did our best trying to get a hold of it. But we'd always go find a few chopping list titles and then pick up a few other random things on the side. We just discovered so much. I look back at all those years of renting when I was young, and in Marion, Iowa, where I was growing up, there were so many rental places. There were, at least probably a dozen that were active for the bulk of my youth here. And my friend's brother and I would go and rent armloads of tapes the same way and just watch as much as we could during a sleepover or over the course of a weekend or what have you, and got introduced to the universe that way, to the world. But really later on, as Shane, you and I were kind of honing our interests and trying to figure out what we were super into, that was instrumental in everything that was to come. And your shared enthusiasm about this stuff was also very important to me, continuing my efforts to eventually, just like you said, there's no reason for anyone to think that they'll ever end up in the pages of a magazine like Fangoria. So I can't say it was a dream of mine. But eventually, when I decided to take the leap on that, all those roads go back to you and I reading those magazines and discussing them and sending each other goofy ass faxes and whatever else. It was great. And you're certainly a treasured friend, man. And thank you for all the kind words about stuff. The Rue Morgue thing blows my mind. Still, I never thought that I'd end up there. And being in the Halloween issue for my first little outing, there's a couple little bits that I wrote for that. In the 50 vilest villains column for it, I covered Big Ronnie from Greasy Strangler and then Jack from the house that Jack built in there. And it's a little footprint, but nonetheless, my name's on that masthead. And I always maintained, even if it happened once, it didn't matter how big or small it was, that was the world to me. And now there's going to be a larger piece in the next issue that I hope you enjoy, Shane, because you have that subscription. And I'm very proud of it as well, and so excited to be there. It really means a lot that you are tracking all this stuff down. Shane always sends me a picture every month of the newest Remind magazine column of mine, because he usually gets it like a day or two before me, and he'll send me a picture of it, and it's exciting for me. It's like going to the newsstand for the first time again. Every single month when these things come out, it's a blast and a true honor. As far as the process with a company like Shout Factory, for example, it can run a number of different ways in terms of how I end up working on a title. Most of the time, or let's say it's Shout or Paramount or whoever it might be, they will present to me in a meeting a list of titles, and they'll say, all right, here's what's coming up. What do you want? And then I'll get to pick and choose. Of course, we're discussing, okay, what's the due date on it? What's the budget look like? What are we already porting forward? So I have a lay of the land for each one of them. But then it is my choice whether I want to take it on or not. There have been some occasions where I've taken titles to them. The most notable ones, I'd say, or to other labels, the most notable Shout titles that I've taken to them would be Sleepaway Camp, and that was through my relationship with Felissa and the director Robert Hiltzik. So there was Sleepaway Camp, and then there was also Body Bags, John Carpenter's Body Bags, which was something that John had been kind of sitting on, and so I brought that to Shout too and got them together at the table for it. Silent Night, Deadly Night was another one, which I mentioned on the last episode is now hitting 4K from Shout. And that was a title where the producers came to me after their Anchor Bay deal was up, and they're like, look, we don't know where to go. What do? We don't really know anybody else in this realm. Can you help us? And I was like, oh my gosh, absolutely. And that's kind of what pulled me back out of the woodwork, getting back into special features after a little bit of a break that I had taken at that time. And then Haunt over at Ronin Flicks, Scott Beck and Brian Wood's film. The three of us had just been discussing frankly, lackluster initial release of that on DVD only at Walmart, which was crazy from the studio, wanting to do something bigger, and they were able to pull the right strings to get that to work out. And then we did this Haunt box set that was crazy and super expansive. And so those are some examples of movies where I was in direct connection with the filmmakers and knew that I could take them somewhere and find a home for them. Rolf Konevsky is another example of that. Rolf and I were talking about what happened to his catalog. Now that there was a Vinegar Syndrome release of There's Nothing Out There that had been fallen out of print. And we were looking at the whole catalog, though. I mean, a number of his pictures, like Nightmare Man and some others, and started shopping them around for him. And we ended up getting a deal also at Ronin Flicks. Ronin is they don't have the kind of overhead that a company like Shout does, where they have a lot of commercial consideration to put in front of a creative decision or maybe a passion-driven decision to take a movie on for distribution. And so they were wonderful about taking Rolf's films, bringing them in, and I've done a number of other titles for them that were a similar situation, like that just is coming out recently here, or about to come out rather, is Spiral, the Adam Green film. It's another one where Adam and the other guys who made that film were just like, man, this has been left and sort of in the wasteland, and we need to rescue it and get it a proper release, and that's exactly what Ronin was able to offer. So there are the smaller labels that have a lot more flexibility. In those cases, they don't usually come to me wanting me to do anything. Like Ronin, I don't think has ever done that, where they just give me a call and say, hey, we have this upcoming film. Do you want to work on it? But there have been some where we're working on one thing and it leads to another, and they say, okay, now that you're doing this, it has some similar people in it to this other film that we've licensed. Can you also work on that one? Then we can piggyback these interviews. And that makes a lot of sense economically, of course. And then that gives me an opportunity to work on something I wouldn't have expected to. Paramount was always sort of a one-off type thing where I haven't ever had like a real heavy roster at one time from them like I do, especially from Shout and Arrow and those others, where Paramount would have a title and they'd come to me with it and offer me the option on it if I want to take it on. And so to your question about whether I love all of it, frankly, no. There have been many movies that I didn't even know about until I got the gig on them, especially in the early days at Shout. There were some that I was not familiar with, like Superstition was one of them. Screamers was another one. These are two movies I hadn't ever seen. And so you learn about them as you're working on them. Jan de Bont's The Haunting was one for Paramount that I was not really all that familiar with when I went into it. But of course, through my research and everything prior to starting to film things, I learn all about it. I have watched the movie many times before I have anyone in the chair. And usually by that point, I've come on board for whatever element or elements are there to be had. And I can't think of any movies that I've worked on where I'm just like, this is just not good. This is no good. Many movies for like TerraVision, where I would be cutting trailers for stuff that maybe never had a trailer before, that was almost exclusively a path of discovery with them. A lot of the shot on video stuff that I had never heard of. And then that's their bread and butter. That's really what they specialize in. These are movies that have been straight to video and maybe been neglected for a long time, and they wanted to give them a grander release. And so it was neat to be part of those. So I really can't think of any that I just walk away scratching my head on, like, why are they doing this? What is the goal with re-releasing this movie? Because everything has an audience, right? And everybody puts their toe into the horror water, just like we were, Shane, back in the day, going through that chopping list and picking out movies that anything we could find, we were down to rent. It was a complete openness. And I don't recall being judgmental about just about anything back then. It was everything offered something. And I think that influenced my perspective on taking these kinds of gigs way down the road with this production stuff, because it's like everything offers something. And it's all been a tremendous honor. And thank you for the support there, man, and for mentioning the CD and all that stuff. And it's great to hear from you and have you on the program here. Love to you and the family, man.
Hey, Justin, this is Scotty Cross. I hope you're doing well. I've got a few questions, or maybe just two. Number one, this is an easy one. Of all the movies you've seen this year, what's your favorite so far? And then number two, when you prepare and you get ready to do bonus features for a movie, what do you look forward to the most when preparing to do those features? That's about it. Thanks for doing this, Justin. And as always, much love to you. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Great to hear from you, Scotty. Thank you so much for calling in. Looking at the films this year, there have been some intriguing ones. I'm kind of out of the loop in terms of seeing new stuff. Again, I'm just going to have to refer to my crazy schedule as it's been this year, which hasn't allowed me a lot of time to go to theaters. I have managed to see a few, and out of those that I've seen, I would say that some fall in the category of interesting, like In a Violent Nature. I thought that was an intriguing new approach to the, I guess you'd say, slasher subgenre. I thought that Sasquatch Sunset was, caught me completely off guard. I try to keep myself as blank a slate as possible before seeing anything, because I don't want to know too much, and trailers today tend to give stuff away, And I remember that stuff. And so I don't want to be sitting there waiting for big moments to come across the screen. And I went into Sasquatch Sunset unaware of the fact that it was a scoreless, essentially almost like a documentary about the seasons in the life of a family of Sasquatches. And it was as wild as it was sometimes funny, sometimes shocking, always beautiful. I mean, gorgeous cinematography from front to back, but it was really just a brave stroke. It was a film that you would never expect a studio to release, yet let alone get wide release on. So I really admire what everyone poured into that one. I thought Longlegs was good. Of course, I'm showing up because I love Oz Perkins. I love Nick Cage. And the cinematography in that film, as is the case with all of Oz's films, was absolutely gorgeous. I did think Cage was really good in it. I need to revisit it, though, because the first impression of it wasn't real strong for me, but I'm looking very much forward to revisiting that one. I'd say so far this year, and this may sound like a bit of a homer answer here, but I would say that my favorite film that I've seen is Heretic from Scott Beck and Brian Woods. In fact, the piece that I have coming up in the next Rue Morgue magazine is on Heretic, and it involves an interview with Scott and Brian on that film. This movie comes out, I think, within the next month or so here. I want to say it's maybe end of October or maybe November when it lands. I can't remember the exact street date, but it's a striking movie that is bold in ways that are kind of similar to how Sasquatch Sunset was bold. It approaches religion and challenges it head on. And you have Hugh Grant in a performance that I think is going to be completely unexpected for people who just know him as the romance movie guy from the 90s. This is something so outside of any way that I've ever seen him before. And it's a very, very just whip smart script from Scott and Brian that they spent 10 years researching for. They went through so much to steep themselves in all the different world religions, so their character that Grant plays can speak to these things with a genuine knowledge and not just seem like he's generally riffing on something. So it's a very smart script, very tense movie that continues to ratchet up the tension as it runs from front to back. And it's strong performances from everybody. I mean, it's the kind of movie that really could almost be turned into a stage play because it's just essentially three people in a space and all that they go through until that explodes into some really unexpected territory in the final reel. But I was really impressed with what Scott and Brian were trying to say with the film, how thought-provoking it is, and the way that they wanted to make something that encouraged conversation after the film was done. And there's no question that everybody who walks out of the theater after seeing Heretic is going to have a lot to discuss and a lot to consider in an introspective way, especially if they are religious in any way. So that has been my favorite so far this year. And I saw that at a friends and family screening early on. I have not seen the final film cut. I know that what I saw was pretty substantially longer than what, of course, will end up on the screens all across the country. But even just based on that longer version, I can't recommend it highly enough. And I hope everyone goes and checks that out. And then, Scotty, your question about when I work on a title, what am I looking forward to the most? My favorite thing is just sitting down and having the conversation. That is 100% my most prized element in all of this. I love the research. I like the challenge of all of the putting the pieces together to make sure that we can get scheduling down and locations and everything else. Of course, I love all the elements of it, but what really is the magic for me is when I'm sitting there having the conversation with someone, engaging in something truly sincere, and where I get to learn so much in real time from these people about their creative adventures, about the lessons that they've learned, and about how they approach the craft. It's 100% the best part of it. So, and that's something that, I mean, that goes back to my earliest days in writing or doing interviews when I had a radio show for a little while, things like that. I mean, that's the heart of it for me. And just loving capturing people's stories, preserving that history, and getting to experience it in real time. Thank you, Scotty, for calling in, man. Always great to hear your voice, and I hope to see you again soon, brother.
Hey, Justin. This is Bill Van Vagel from Land of the Creeps podcast, frequent podcast partner and frequent hockey talker. Anyways, I hear this is the choice of the listener, so I thought I'd give you a question that's going to make you use your little gray matter, your little gray cells, and think for a little bit. So I'm curious about your answer. Here you go. So you're going to create yourself a dinner party, and the dinner party is to anybody past or present that is involved in Hollywood, or maybe just off the beaten path from Hollywood, somebody in the movie industry, and you're going to invite 4 people. It's going to be a rousing success of a party, food, drinks, frivolity, but you can choose any 4 you want, but they must fall into one of these 4 invitational categories. 1, it must be a female actress from present or past, any genre, any type, any era. 1 male actor, any type, any genre, any era. Could be a side character or a main draw. And you must also invite 1 director and 1 producer. And as a bonus, what is your meal going to be? Anyways, going to make you think. Love listening. I support you. Can't wait to podcast with you again. Talk to you later. Oh, here's a bonus question. Who's going to be the new second-line winger for the Habs now that Liney's hurt? Anyways, that's a question for another day. Talk to you later.
I mentioned Bill earlier. We really do text about hockey pretty much every day. And it's great because he's a Habs fan, Montreal Canadiens, and I don't have a whole lot of friends who are. In fact, I can count them on one finger, Bill, as you know. So it's so great for us to be able to stay in touch and connect on that all the time. And you help me get hyped for the season every year and then throughout it. I like that. And your approach is never like so doom and gloom because this is a hard team to be a fan of. It's kind of like the Cubs, which is my favorite baseball team, where the seasons don't always go very well. And while they have a storied past, boy, oh boy, since I've been dialed into them, it has been a rough trip to take. But Bill, you really help with that. And so that means the world. And thank you for calling in here. Really intriguing question. I would say, looking at the parameters that you've established here on this one for this dinner, I would, first of all, I'd want to have it at the Stanley Hotel, if I could. I would love to have the ballroom there to ourselves in the middle of winter where we're all snowed in, where there aren't any outside distractions for anything. And it's kind of a creative retreat. So I would hope that there would be creative endeavors with these folks too. Maybe it's sparked at this dinner that you're talking about. The female actress that I would like to bring in would probably be Maud Feely, who's a silent film actress. Actually, she made her way eventually into the sound films, but I just love Maud Feely. Her approach to how she handled acting, I thought, was really interesting at a time when she was really breaking boundaries. And she wasn't just doing film, she was doing stage. Actually, stage, of course, is where she began. But she also became a teacher, and she taught acting all over the place and really stayed true to her mission of helping nurture up-and-coming actors, and in particular actresses, in their careers and helping guide them into smart choices. So it wasn't just acting that she was dealing with people. It was also nurturing professionally, making good decisions, good business decisions, how to read contracts and things. She's a fascinating character that not a lot has been written about. There is one pretty slim book on her that's out there. It's called, I think, A Life Worth Living, or a Worthwhile Life. It's a good read, but I'm excited at some point to have someone, maybe I'll do it, dive in deeper on her entire life story, because she really did it all, from Broadway to local productions, like I mentioned, the educational aspect of what she does, and then on to film, and in not only the silence, but also tiptoeing into the sound era as well. I also collect postcards of Maud because she became, I mean, she was really celebrated. And at that time, the way that you got the word out about yourself and the sort of avenue to be promoted was oftentimes through postcards. So when she would be part of a new production, they would take some stills and then they'd sell these postcards that would travel the world. And I found some really cool ones from throughout her career. And some of the neatest part of that is the stories on the back of them, what people were writing to each other. It oftentimes, most often, doesn't even reference her necessarily, but there would be people sharing their lives, catching up with someone, or maybe a love letter or something like that. I love vintage postcards. I'll go to antique stores and just spend so long digging through those bins, and they're always pretty cheap. So sometimes I'll just go on eBay and I'll find a lot of them, like used Valentine's Day postcards are especially interesting because it's people sharing their love with each other and writing to each other about their longing to be together, because obviously they can't if they're communicating by mail. And Maud's a big part of that. So I actually have several framed collections of her postcards on the wall in my office here. And she was really, really amazing. As far as a male actor goes, I'm tempted to say Bela Lugosi here. I would love to learn more about him as a person, because I think he's a fascinating character. He's another one that did a lot of stage work prior to getting involved with film. And everyone knows about the whole Universal monster cycle with him and then his sort of Skid Row type pictures that he was doing. But there's got to be a lot more there. You look at those early pictures of him where he's posed real regally or with his dog in front of his house at the gate, things like that. I want to know more about Bela. And I feel like most of the documentaries that are out there pretty much just focus on him as Dracula for the most part, which is cool. I have one of those. I have the A&E biography of Bela Lugosi on a videotape that was taped off of TV back when I was in high school, I think. And I've carried that with me all these years. And it's one of the things that I make a point to watch every October. It was originally shown in October when I was recording it back in the day. So it has all the commercials in there, all of the Halloween-themed wraparound stuff. And I just really treasure it. But even in that, they don't go real deep into his full career and his personal life. As far as a director, 100% I would say Ed Wood. And this does tie a little bit to Bela Lugosi in my interest in him, I guess, of course, because of Plan 9 and Bride of the Monster. But I am endlessly fascinated with Ed. And I love the book Nightmare of Ecstasy by, I think, Rudolph Gray is the author. I think that the film Ed Wood that Tim Burton made is my favorite love letter to cinema and ambition that's out there. Ed had such a diverse career, and much of it, especially, he never really attained success per se, but he never slowed down and never stopped. And you get a feeling for that in Ed Wood, which covers a portion of his career, the film Ed Wood, but also there was so much more before and after that. And his ambition, his drive, his ceaseless energy to make things happen is something that I'm often referencing when I'm down and out, when I'm having a down period, when I'm overwhelmed by projects and whatever else. I'll put the film Ed Wood in, or I'll put in, I have a couple documentaries about Ed, or I'll pull out the Nightmare of Ecstasy book and reread that just to remind myself that ambition and doing things matters. Just doing stuff. You don't need to do it with commercial consideration. Creating for yourself is okay. And in fact, it may be the most important endeavor that someone can take on. And I see Ed, even though there's people who say he's the worst filmmaker of all time. Anybody who flips through Tubi knows that's not absolutely not the truth, as we've been learning in recent years, especially with a lot of the stuff that's out there. But you can't argue against this man's love for film and his undying dedication to the craft. And he was also a prolific writer. He got into the adult film world. He was doing whatever he could to create with whatever means he had available to him. And I think that's a valuable lesson for anybody who's looking to get into film. So he's someone to look up to and someone that I absolutely do. And that's who I would love to have at the table as a director. And then as a producer, it would be someone a little bit newer. It would be David Kirshner, the producer of the Child's Play franchise. I think I've talked before on the show about the incredible interview I did with David on Child's Play 1 through 3 when I was working on those Blu-rays or 4Ks for Shout Factory a couple years ago. Going to his house and spending a day with him, going through the history of these films, but also his personal history is so interesting. And this is what I mean. Like I said earlier, everyone has a story to tell. Everyone is interesting if you're willing to take the time to dive deep. And what I discovered with David, he created he designed Chucky. He came up with the original concept for Chucky. The Child's Play, he has nurtured along from front to back and continues to carry that flag to this day. But also, if you turn back the clock, he also created, ultimately, Strawberry Shortcake, of all things. He was the album artist for the cover art for Neil Diamond for many years. In fact, he won a Grammy for his cover design on The Jazz Singer. That was David Kirshner. His story is amazing. He created An American Tale and tells an amazing story behind the origin of that project in the interview. I think it's on the first Child's Play disc, where he talks about his pitch to Steven Spielberg and how that whole thing went down. And if you have that Blu-ray, put it in and check that interview out, because it might not be the first one you would think to go to, but it is far and away the most interesting out of everybody that I brought in on that project, and including some wild stories from behind the scenes there that I won't spoil here, but please do check that out. But he would be a fantastic person to have at the table because he's been in so many walks of entertainment, from music to art. He was really close friends with Ray Bradbury and was really the driving force behind what became the Halloween Tree TV special, which is another one of my every year October rewatches. I love that cartoon so much. It's probably my favorite animated film. And it was David who kept pushing Ray to allow that to happen. He also came up with, he was behind the Hocus Pocus films. I mean, I could go on and on and on. He's a fascinating guy who's been doing incredible things for decades and would be a tremendous addition to that dinner table. As far as what the meal would be, it would be vegetarian Indian food, because that's my favorite food in the whole world. And we would have a great salad, and we would have some good wine with it, and we would all have a wonderful time. So that would be it for me on the food front. I can't say anything about the second winger for the Habs. There's so much in play right now with them that, oh my gosh, they're riddled with injuries right now as we're heading into the start of the season, and I have no idea how things are going to pan out. But it's going to be fun to watch, and it's going to be great to talk with you about, Bill. So thank you for always being in touch, and thank you for calling in.
Hey, Justin, this is Christian Day calling. I had a question that popped up the other day. I was looking for a film, and I, of course, find it on YouTube, and has not had a Blu-ray release. And I see that you can purchase the film like as a digital download, but then you scroll down a couple of videos, I'll see the same movie that someone ripped and just put it online. Why is that not caught? And how do you handle that? Do you say something? I don't know, I'm not sure if anyone actually would say something, but how can a film that's for sale on YouTube and it be like listed in the same list as the same movie that has been like ripped and thrown on there and like no one has said anything? So that's my question. Maybe you have the answer, maybe you don't. Also, as for fun, you should also tell your audience, if they don't know, your first time working out of a grip truck with a very famous Iowa gaffer. So those are my questions and requests. I guess that last one's more of a request. All right. Bye.
Thank you for calling in, Christian. Great to hear from you as always. Christian has a great show called the Iowa Basement Tapes that's on all podcasting platforms and also on radio here in Iowa through the public station, where he plays all Iowa-based or Iowa-relevant music from over all of time. He's been archiving. He has an incredible back catalog in his collection of just about every band that he can possibly get his hands on that has ever done anything here in the state of Iowa. And it's a remarkable collection, a remarkable feat. And his show, Iowa Basement Tapes, is excellent. Every single week he's on there playing stuff, most of which you wouldn't have heard before. So his efforts are really appreciated. He's also a prolific documentary filmmaker. He was on this show a couple episodes ago talking about a new series, a couple series that he was producing. The first one was Taken Together, Who Killed Lyric and Elizabeth, and then the other one was The Last Gay Bar in America, which is a great series that's on Out TV. And Christian and I work on all kinds of stuff together. He served as editor for me on some stuff for mostly Shout Factory in the days where I was still trying to get my feet under me in the editing realm. So he did a lot of that for me. But then also, I mean, we're doing all kinds of stuff now. We have a documentary feature that we're in the middle of production on and some other things. So great to hear from you, Christian. Your question about this bootleg stuff that's on YouTube, man, I have no idea. That site is so good about checking for copyright. I think most of it's tied to music, it seems. When I upload a video there, it does a scan of the audio on the episode, and it seems to be primarily wanting to pull anything that's musically copywritten. That's the stuff that it seems to catch. I'm not sure how it works in the film world, but I'm sure that, I mean, there have to be algorithms in there that you'd think would catch it. My guess as to how something would end up on there right next to a video that's for sale, you have a bootleg version of that same film. My guess would be in most cases, those are probably movies that are under the radar, older fringe films, cult movies, stuff that YouTube's not really focusing on because it's not the latest Marvel film that everyone's trying to rip and trying to make some money off of in various illegal ways. That would be my assumption. There are people out there who fight this stuff. I've done a lot of fighting for director Bill Rebane in this regard, trying to help pull down bootleg versions of his various films when they pop up on there. I know that Pam Pierce, who's Charles B. Pierce's daughter, her efforts to keep Legend of Boggy Creek out of bootleg circles are just heroic. I mean, simply heroic. She's not just fighting it on YouTube. She's fighting the bootlegs that are on eBay and everywhere else. And every day she's trekking through and hunting these folks down, sending cease and desist, filing complaints and things like that. And her main mission is it isn't what you'd think it would be. What Pam is trying to do is make sure that when people are seeing Legend of Boggy Creek, that they're seeing the best version of that film that they can see. She wants the experience to be the one that her dad envisioned. And it's not just Boggy Creek, it's also Town That Dreaded Sundown and whatever other movies her dad was involved with, but primarily Boggy Creek, which has been one of the most bootlegged movies in history. And a lot of that was because there really wasn't a good proper release of it for decades until her recent Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs that she put out with his new transfers that I was part of working on. But I mean, I can't imagine the hours that she's put into trying to track this stuff down and get it shot down. And so that goes back to the point, though, Christian, that a lot of these filmmakers may not be around anymore to hunt for this stuff, or maybe these are older films and there's no one out there trying to fight the good fight to keep it out of crappy bootleg circles and get it into proper release, or to have people focus on the proper releases that are out there. I know I've had some of my stuff bootlegged. I know that especially early on, the Sleepaway Camp documentary that was on that Shout Factory release that I mentioned earlier on this episode, that was put on YouTube almost immediately when that was released. I haven't ever tried to fight it. I'm not at Shout Factory. I don't think I can file any kind of complaint against it because I don't certainly own it or anything like that. But that has been viewed so many more times that I'm sure people have purchased copies of that disc. So I kind of look at that. I mean, if it's something that's out of my control, where I don't have any influence over it, I guess I just sort of shrug and think, well, at least people are seeing it. And maybe they'll think to look at other releases that I'm a part of or something like that. Although who knows if that's ever been the case or not. But it's nice to know that people are out there, hundreds of thousands or whatever, are watching this stuff one way or another. If I was the owning entity, I would certainly be very interested in trying to track that stuff down and get it taken out of commission, because you want people to go to the source and you want them to pick up that disc and have the best presentation that they can and experience it like it's meant to be experienced. So it's a complicated world, this whole discussion about bootlegs and especially piracy online. It's so rampant. And look what it did to the music industry. It just eviscerated it. And now streaming mixed with piracy they're really taking their toll on the film world. You see it all the time. I mean, this is why film is in the state that it's in right now, is because of these factors. The two primary factors are streaming stuff and the piracy. So I'm not sure that's an equation that'll ever be figured out, Christian. I just don't know. As far as working out of a grip truck, I mean, the earliest film stuff that I was doing behind the camera was with some independent Iowa filmmakers, and I was just looking to work on anything that I could. So I often served as a grip or as a PA or as sometimes a gaffer on indie productions for short films mostly, just to get the experience. And there's no better way to learn this business. There is no better way than to just go in head first on whatever and as many productions as you can possibly be a part of, no matter what role they need you to serve in. And that's where I learned everything in those early days: how to properly wrap a cord, how to use a C-stand appropriately, which side are the knobs on. I mean, everything from those simpler sounding logistic things onto the overall mechanics of running a production of any scale, which is a feat no matter how big or small your film is. That's where I was cutting my teeth for sure. I think you might be referring to, and this is going to be another reference to Scott Beck and Brian Woods, when I was working as the best boy on their MTV film called Spread. And on that, I was working for John Van Allen, who's well known around Iowa. He has one of the most well-traveled grip trucks in the Midwest, and especially in Iowa historically. And it was a really informative experience for me. Working out of that truck taught me, again, going back to school, I'm just an eternal student of this stuff. That was when I learned all about flags and about the different lights and putting marks on the floor. And it's amazing what a gaffer does on a set. It's a role that I think very few people really know much about, because it's certainly not glamorous in any way. But they're at the heart of every single shot that you're seeing in a film. And on a film set, they're often the ones who are there every single moment from A to Z, trying to help everything move smoothly. And they're really the problem solvers a lot of the time. You have your DP, who has a lot to focus on. You have your director, of course, who's going a million different directions all the time. And you're there looking visually at where things are. You are right there in the action. So if a spot that someone, a mark that someone needs to hit needs to be marked, you always have tape on your belt so you can lay those marks down for them. That's something I learned from working with John and out of that truck. It's, man, I can't say enough about that time and about what that film meant. It didn't end up getting picked up by MTV. It was part of some contest that Scott and Brian had won, but it was an incredible experience nonetheless. And that really cemented my friendship with them too. And then with John and everything else that's come in its wake. I mean, it all adds up. All these experiences inform whatever comes next. And that was a hugely influential time in my life. And that helped me fall in love even deeper with movies. Thank you for calling in, Christian. Great to hear from you. I also have a few questions that are submitted through messaging or through email. The first one is from John Vance, who actually posed a question to me that I want to turn around to the audience here. It's a really interesting concept that he's talking about. So he says, has there ever been a commentary track that you know of that acts as an extension of the movie? Almost like a radio play or just small scripted production where the characters or witnesses are reviewing the events that were documented in the movie, or the people in the commentary are portraying the real life versions of the fictionalized characters in the movie that was based on their events. John says, I've heard commentaries where an actor will stay in character, but it's usually in a comedic sense. He's not sure about a more straightforward approach with that. He was listening to the commentary when he wrote this to Late Night with the Devil, and he was thinking that it would be fun if it was from the perspective of someone interviewing an audience member that survived, going over the events, and they would be giving the perspective of someone who saw it all unfold. He says it might be a little niche of an idea, but he thinks it would be a lot of fun. I agree. I think that would be great. I've heard those in-character commentaries, and frankly, a lot of times they're pretty cringy. I think that it doesn't necessarily work real well. There was a concept for Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 where Eric Freeman, who plays Ricky in that movie, was interested initially in doing a commentary as Ricky. And I didn't have a good feel for how that would come off in any way that might just sort of get tedious for audiences, not because of Eric in any way, but just keeping that up for 90 minutes and talking through this as the character. I wasn't 100% sold on it. We ended up pivoting to doing a short film that was included with that release through Shout Factory, where it was called Ricky Today. It was something that Eric wrote, and it's an extension of the film. So it's Ricky in prison, current day, being interviewed by someone, and at the end of it, he escapes. It was a fun idea. We shot it after his interview for the documentary piece that accompanied that release, and it ended up getting included as a special bonus feature, little addition in there. It's a fun way for Eric to have written something that gives a little more, I guess you'd say, texture to his character of Ricky, and maybe could act as something of a bridge to what he hopes will eventually be a sequel to that film. So anyway, that was the solution when this did come up in real life for me, where the concept of doing an in-character commentary was posed. I'm curious, though, anyone who's listening, have you ever encountered a commentary track that does what John is talking about here, where there are characters who are expanding on the story that's presented in the film, that they're, adding extra context to what we've already witnessed in watching the movie, maybe adding new characters or something like that? I would love to hear from you. So hit me up through social media or through my website and let me know if you've ever encountered something like this. I think John would love to hear too. So I'll be reporting back to him with whatever the feedback is. Really intriguing question there, John. Very, very, very cool. Jules Sains wrote in asking, do you think we'll ever get another Kolchak the Night Stalker series? And who would you cast to play Kolchak? I love the Kolchak show. I like the movies, but I really love the show. I think it's great that MeTV shows this on Saturday nights after Svengoolie. It's like the last show on that lineup that they call like Sci-Fi Saturdays or something like that. And it runs late at night. It's so much fun to revisit. I just love everything about it. And from the fact that it's a newspaper reporter on to these fantastic adventures that he goes on. And I love how brazen he is. I really treasure that character. It's kind of like Jim Rockford in the Rockford Files, which is one of my all-time favorite TV series, where these guys have boundless confidence with what they're walking into. They very rarely run into a situation where they're left without some sort of a solution that they could come up with. And they're facing the most insane situations in both programs, not to mention all the colorful side characters that are there and their relationships with whoever that's around them. So 2 shows I absolutely love. I'll always find an excuse to get some Rockford Files into the discussion. But in terms of Kolchak coming back, I don't see why not. It's the perfect setup for something that could be revisited at any time. They could be made relevant to any generation, for sure. I think that now, with special effects being what they are, I think that just about anything is possible there. And we're also living in an era that we're all too familiar with, for better or for worse, where Hollywood is intent and very focused on revisiting stuff that we've already seen. They want what they call IPs that are already comfortable for the public and that are already known. It seems to me Kolchak would be ripe for the picking for that kind of a thing. Why not return to that and do something to bring that back to life? I would absolutely love it. In terms of who I would have play Kolchak, it would have to be someone who could approach it with a sense of humor, because humor is a huge part of what made that original performance by Darren McGavin so great. is that he wasn't just some hard-nosed reporter. He was a guy who approached everything with some humor, and that's what really helped him get by. And same with James Rockford. There's a lot of humor in his relationships and interactions with people and the crazy stuff that he tries to pull off. So I think it would have to be an actor who could make that kind of humor work, but also who could pull off the physical stuff and the intensity of dealing with these horrifying situations. I'm kind of at a loss here, Jewel, in terms of who I would point to portray him in this day and age. Just throwing someone out there, I think maybe it would be interesting to have someone like a Crispin Glover, for example, who's kind of my default answer. Whenever someone says, who should be the next James Bond? I'm like, boy, it would be cool to see Crispin play James Bond. And then everyone goes, you're full of shit. That's a terrible idea. Maybe it's a terrible idea for him to play Kolchak, but I think it could be a lot of fun. And it would add a quirky element to it that I think would be wonderful. And Crispin is such a fan of the arcane. There's no way that he wouldn't just swim in that character. And the opportunity to play somebody on a week-to-week basis on a series that would be that adventurous and wild. So I'm just going to throw that at you, Jewel. I think Crispin Glover would be my answer. Brian Godsill writes, what's the ultimate drive-in double feature? One classic over 30 years old, and what short should run in between? For this one, I would point to Legend of Boggy Creek. I think that's, in my mind, the ultimate drive-in film, because that's really where it got a lot of its footing back in the day, but also it just plays so well at a drive-in. Brian was there when I hosted Legend of Boggy Creek and Trick or Treat a few years ago at a drive-in here in Iowa, and it was it was so much fun. I put on a ghillie suit and ran around in between the cars, scaring people as the movie was playing. It was a hoot. And so I would pair Legend of Boggy Creek with Drive-In Massacre, I think, which may not be the first film that comes to mind for most people when they're thinking about, what do I want to see at the drive-in? But I really love that movie for a lot of reasons. One, it was co-written by Buck Flower, who's one of my all-time favorite actors and one of the greatest, if not the greatest, character actor of all time. Love Buck Flower. But also, it's set at a drive-in, and you get to see everything from when the drive-in is open. You get to see it during the day when they're setting up concessions and things, and there's all this drama going around about murders and things throughout the whole bit. But I just love it because you're spending 90 minutes at a drive-in in its various states of existence. And that could be, when kids are sneaking in the trunks of cars, and there are murders, there's some bumbling cops, there's some weirdos that they investigate. That movie is a lot of fun and has a totally bizarro score to it. But that's kind of an unsung gem, I think, and what I would pick for that if you're looking at older stuff. And then the final question here is from Lynn Amaker, who is my webmaster actually at justinbeahm.com and also my tech guru throughout my entire, really dating back so many years. We met when I was working at some newspapers in central Illinois. I was the assistant editor there, and our office was in Farmer City, Illinois. I think I've mentioned it before. And Lynn was doing all the layout stuff, the ad design and things, and we hit it off really quickly. First, we were the only two people of relevant age to each other in the office. It was a lot of older folks who were super sweet locals that taught me all about this community that I was traversing, doing coverage for everything from the high school sports through to when a business would open. I had a regular columns in there on some of the older folks in the area, capturing their stories. One of my favorites was 80 and Active, where I'd go to nursing homes and just ask who's the most interesting person you've got here, and then spend some time with them. I actually met a gentleman through that column who did the cover artwork for a lot of Louis L'Amour books, strangely enough. And in his closet there in Farmer City, Illinois, he had originals of this Louis L'Amour artwork that was just absolutely stunning and such a great story. So anyway, Lynn and I met way back then, and when the internet was in its infancy, Lynn and I were playing around with websites. There was a time when I, on a whim, wrote to Apix. I don't know if anybody listening remembers Apix. It was a distributor that specialized mostly in direct-to-video horror stuff. If you have videotapes from back then of Jack Frost, Uncle Sam, The Surgeon, there were a number of different titles that they put out. But Apex was a big name in, like Shane mentioned earlier, in the chopping list in Fangoria every month. That's how I encountered Apex. But anyway, on a whim once, I wrote to them and I asked them about a website. They didn't have one yet. And I said I would love to be their webmaster. And to my surprise, considering I had absolutely no qualifications to do so, they wrote back and said, absolutely. And this was by mail. I wrote to them, by the way. They wrote back and said, absolutely. And here's 2 discs full of images, behind the scenes stuff, posters, promotional materials, everything you could need to create a site. Go nuts and just keep us up to date on what you're doing. And Lynn helped me build that. He helped me put that together back then. And it wasn't real long-lived before they realized that we should probably have someone professional do this internally and make it look a little bit less like shit. But it was an awesome early experience for me, and kind of the first time that I was ever trusted by anyone in the film realm to be part of anything. So anyway, Lynn and I have been pals forever. He has always run my website. He is the creative guru on all that technical stuff. We're in touch every single day, all day. We're messaging. He's kind of my office partner, even though we live in different states, where we're connected through Skype all day and just helping each other out on projects. And now, in addition to the website stuff, he also does graphic work on a lot of the titles that I do. So if I need a title treatment to be recreated, or like on the recent Bewitched box set, or the one that's coming out, I guess, in like January or February from Mill Creek, he cleaned up and created the background for the intro for the documentary piece in there, where he recreated the skyline from that famous opening credit sequence in Bewitched. So Lynn is a jack of many trades. He's also a tremendous photographer. He does a lot of nonprofit work, and he's just a great friend. I mean, above all else, he's a great friend. But anyway, he writes in and says, hey, what is the environment in your office like? What do you have sitting around you in your office that you're surrounded by every day? It's a really interesting question, because environment in the office and the creative space has always been very, very important to me. I don't like to clutter it up with too much stuff, but everything that is here has some kind of personal resonance with me. Most things have been gifted to me that I have sitting on shelves, or it's artwork from artists I love. It's photography from photographers I love. And just looking around in here, just a bit of a sampling of some of the things that are within view. I have on one wall behind me, and also things that just mean a lot to me personally. Like one wall behind me, among a bunch of other photographs, is a picture of me and my brother Mitch on Christmas Eve. I don't know how old I would have been here, maybe 6. And in between us is my grandmother, who I was very, very close with. And she's reading us the Crestwood House King Kong book. On Christmas Eve, that's what I wanted to hear when I was a kid, was not, the night before Christmas necessarily. I was like, well, Grandma, can you read this? And so here she is reading King Kong to us. Above that is a sketch that Basil Gogos sent me before he passed away. I'd say it was maybe 6 months before we lost him. It's of Frankenstein tromping through a cemetery. That's a treasured thing for me. On the other side of that same wall, I have a still from A Ghost Story that came with the Ghost Story photography book that the director put out. I have a Carey Price 2 photo framed piece of, he was the goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens, tremendous player, and it was one of those 2 images there is autographed by him, and above that is an autographed JFK Revisited poster that's signed by Oliver. Next to that, on the wall to the left, is a piece by Nick Kushner, who's an artist friend of mine who passed away way too early and was going to be the monster in a film that I was going to be making years ago. Before we lost him, quite shockingly, and I went to a gallery exhibition of his at a place called Lethal Amounts in Los Angeles. and he gave me and signed over to me one of these limited edition sort of metallic lithograph prints of a piece of his that he said was his favorite in that show. And that's always meant the world because it kind of keeps Nick in the room here. He was gone not too long after that show, and it's still just a haunting thing for me to have lost him. When and how it happened. Also, other things on the wall, I have a flower from my grandmother's funeral that's in a shadow box, all dried and mounted. I have a piece of partially burned wood from Idlewild, California. That's what I've always described as my home away from home, and that's in the mountains about 3 hours or so east of Los Angeles. And whenever I can, I try to carve out time to go up to Idlewild when I'm done shooting for a week or whatever in LA to clear my head and spend some time in nature. And I'm up there so much that I know a lot of the local shop owners, the people at the newspaper, which I subscribe to. And it really does feel like going home again to go there. But anyway, there was a really bad fire there a few years ago that was started by this creep who had some sort of a vendetta against the town for being arrested for something that he didn't think he should have been arrested for. So he drove around throwing lit flares out the window of his pickup truck. He was arrested, and he's in jail now for that, thank goodness. But what he ended up creating was several 100,000 acres of just absolute destruction. And it almost took the town down. It came within yards of Idlewild proper. And through the diligent efforts of the firefighters, they had planes dropping fire retardant on the edge of the town to try to stop it. They were able to fight it back and end up beating it. But I went up there the first weekend that they were allowing people back into Idlewild after the fire had happened, and I was just floored by the devastation. And there was this one point where you can go out on this sort of curve and look over just miles and miles of valley below. It's all trees normally, animals running around and everything, and it's just gone, black, scorched tree trunks and the remains of this destruction. And I found this little piece of wood that I wanted to take home with me that looks kind of like an angel wing, where the edge of it is burned. The left side of it is still intact. And it's a reminder for me on my wall in a shadow box of not only the fragility of life, but also the destruction that man can wreak on nature and on anything, on each other, on the world. And so I keep that within my view all day, every day in that shadow box for that reason, not just because I love Idlewild and I'm glad that it survived that horrible event, but also I think it's important that we keep this stuff in check about the footprint that we leave on this earth and on the relationships we have. To the right of that is a framed print I did of a photograph I had taken up in Idlewild. So that's kind of like my Idlewild corner there. Down below on top of my bookshelf or movie shelf, which I have several of in the room, there's all kinds of little tchotchke things that I've been given over the years from people. I have a Sharknado Funko Pop there because Sharknado was a thing for me. I have a framed photo from Fort Dells in Wisconsin, which was huge for me when I was little and used to visit my grandparents there in Wisconsin Dells where my dad grew up. I have a King Kong liquor, I don't know what you call these things, but it's a promotional liquor container for the King Kong 76 that was given out at, I think, the premiere or something, or at some early screenings of it. And it's empty, of course. There's no booze in it, but a stunt performer, a friend of mine, gave that to me years ago. And she's like, this will be better with you. And around the neck of that King Kong is a rosary that John Carpenter gave me years ago. It has a flash drive on it of early artwork for his first comic book series, Asylum. And I just ended up on Kong's neck. And back when I got it, I don't know when that was, 2012 or 13 or something. And it's been there ever since. To the right of that is a bottle of the Viper Tenafly that my buddy Jake made for me. trying to make it as screen specific as he could. He got the sticker for the front of the bottle. It has the red cap, the green liquid inside. He did a great job on it, and I love having that sitting up on the shelf. Directly behind that is the letter that my birth mother wrote for me when I was born, and that my adoptive parents eventually gave to me years later. And there's nothing more personal to me than that letter. There's a ring on that same shelf that is from Andrew Divoff, the actor. He continues to make these silver rings of the Djinn from the Wishmaster series that he portrayed. And he gave me that when he was doing his first castings, and he was testing out the mold and everything. And he gave me one of those that I've proudly displayed ever since. Right next to the ring is a tooth that Roy Arbogast gave me years ago. He made it because he was, he made Bruce in Jaws, and he had the mold of the teeth that were put into Bruce's mouth. And when I went to interview him years ago, I show up and he hands me this tooth on a toothpick, and he says, "Hey, I just made this from the mold of Bruce's teeth, and you're welcome to it." So I have a mold of a casting, I guess, of Bruce's tooth sitting there. Next to that is a little pewter drummer boy that my favorite high school teacher, Madeline Olson, gave me at my graduation party, and that I've always held really sacred. There's artwork up there from my son. There's just so much sitting just on that shelf alone that means so much to me. There's next to that on the wall is a Bigfoot picture of Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film that I got from Bob Gimlin, and Bob signed it and sent that to me. Across, there's a door there into a storage area, and then there's the Maud Feely postcards that I mentioned earlier in this episode. Below that is the t-shirt that I have signed by Kurt Cobain, along with the concert ticket from when I met him in Davenport, Iowa. Shortly, not too long before his passing, actually. That's really precious to me. That's in a shadow box. And then I have a bookshelf that was actually from my grandmother that has all of the discs that I've been a part of in it. So it's kind of chronological, but on those shelves in front of those things are some sculptures, some artwork from artists that I like. There's a couple action figures on there. And whenever a new release comes in, a new comp copy of something, I always put it front facing on the shelf so I can enjoy that artwork being there sort of within my view until the next one comes out, and then I put it into the collection that is kind of overgrown into another bookshelf in here. And then throughout this whole office, there's books. There's bookshelves that are just crammed with all kinds of books. I have the complete Crestwood House Monster Series 1 and 2, as well as a lot of their cryptozoology books, a lot of photography books from some of my favorites like Francesca Woodman and some others. Signed poster from the Halloween re-release back in 2012 that I was part of, and that is signed by John Carpenter. I have a Chelsea Wolfe signed record from when I interviewed her at the Stanley Hotel for this podcast a few years ago. Then there's some artwork from the gentleman who created the witch for the Reverend Entertainment kind of logo. That's the tag at the end of most all the releases that I do on these various video releases. And then that would be Justin O'Neill. And I have the original witch piece up there in a frame, and then he did a sort of follow-up piece to it of the witch escaping the gallows and burning it with her powers, which is amazing, along with the church behind it. And then on top of that shelf right there, there's a lot of family pictures, and there's a sculpture, a piece, a one of one from my friend Chris Cooksey, who I'm doing the documentary on, of a figure in a coffin on top of this kind of platform. And you lift it up, and underneath is this incredibly elaborate scene on the underside of it too. And that piece means the universe to me. So cool. But so that's a few of the highlights of what's surrounding me here in the office. Everything has a story. Also the this one's a little wackier, but the Elvis bust that was featured in an episode of Saved by the Bell. I remember as a kid, there was this one episode where I think Screech has a party at his house, and his mom was just worried about, not even about him, she was worried about one thing, and that was her precious Elvis bust that was standing on a podium or like on a stand kind of thing in the corner of the room. And she wanted to make sure that that never got hurt. And of course, what happens in the party, it gets knocked over and smashed into 100 pieces, and then they have to figure out how to rectify the problem. Anyway, I've always thought, as a huge Elvis fan all my life, I've always thought that that bust was the coolest. And then someone sent one to me. I think it was like maybe earlier this year, because I had been long talking about it to people, and someone found one somewhere and sent it to me. So that sits directly to my right on top of one of my many bookshelves in here, right next to a sculpture bust thing of the creature from the Black Lagoon that someone sent me years ago, who knew I was a huge fan of the creature films. So anyway, that's a little snapshot of what my universe is like in this little office. Hardly some gigantic production facility by any means. One-man band here, and humble means and a humble space, but every inch of it is filled with stuff that really means a lot to me. So that wraps up this Q&A episode. Again, I want to really thank Steven Awalt for the idea to do this. I certainly would like to do these again down the road here and there. The voicemail for the show is always open at 951-357-6955. The email is always open as well, radiohourpod@gmail.com. On every episode, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and usually I feature a bit at the end where I play the voicemails that have come in or read those emails or messages through social media, however it got to me, and I'm happy to address whatever questions, comments, or whatever you want to share on the program. So thank you to everyone who reached out, who was a part of this thing. JustinBeahm.com is my website where you can keep up to date on all the stuff that's going on, all the latest. And I'm excited to connect with you again on the next episode. Again, happy October. Let's swim in this best season of the year, and we'll talk to you on the next one.
You have been listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour. The Radio Hour is a production of Reverend Entertainment, copyright 2024. All rights reserved.